This is a dumb fan theory of mine that, well, I don't actually believe it. I think it's very interesting. And it centers around the notion that Javik is not really a Prothean. There are two flimsy pieces of evidence that I will cite. The first is that Protheans look differently in Mass Effect than they do in Mass Effect 2 and 3. As demonstrated here, the Protheans look markedly different than Javik in the later depictions of Protheans via Collectors and Javik's flashbacks. Protheans are depicted as Zoidberg-like, Illithid-style aliens of both Shepard's visions from the beacons and the statues of their likeness found on Ilos. We're told that these creatures are Prothean, yet they look different from the Protheans we come to know by the end of the series. The second piece of evidence has to do with Prothean culture. Conversing with Javik on the SR2 will reveal that the Protheans were militaristic jerkfaces that conquered the galaxy. They were not wondrous beings of culture and peace as Liara thought they were. They were tools that genocided all that opposed them and enslaved the rest. Javik states that all subservient races were rebranded as Prothean. In other words, if the Protheans had existed in Shepard's cycle, Protheans would have conquered the Turians and then forced them to call themselves Protheans. Even though they were biologically Turian, they would identify as Prothean. Palaven, the Turian homeworld, and all other Turian colonies would cease to be Turian. They would belong to the Prothean Empire and be Prothean. Perhaps similar to how the US has states, smaller districts of a larger civilization. If the Protheans conquered the Asari would no longer call themselves Asari. They would call themselves Prothean. If Protheans conquered the known Mass Effect galaxy, a Turian, a human, an Asari, a Solarian, and a Prothean could all walk into a room and say, "Hi, my name is blank, I'm Prothean. Nice to meet you." And they would all be correct. In other words, the Prothean Empire consisted of numerous distinct, unique races, but they were all forced to identify as Protheans. They gave up their previous ethnic identities and became assimilated into the Prothean Empire. A vaguely similar but not one-to-one parallel in the real world, as an example, might be how people have distinct ethnicities, say a Chinese or Italian or Nubian, Canadian, and so forth, but they're all considered Americans because they're citizens of the USA. Similarly, the Protheans conquered other sentient species in the galaxy, and then said, "You're Prothean now, chump. Call yourself a Prothean from now on. We own you. You follow our ways now." So Javik, born and raised both under the rule of the Prothean Empire and during the endgame of that cycle's horrific war against the Reapers, would consider himself Prothean, even if he was not biologically or ethnically a true member of the Prothean species. The combination of these two pieces of evidence is this. Protheans are very different in appearance in the first game compared to the two sequels. Considering that Protheans forced their slave races to identify as Prothean, the discrepancy between the Protheans' original image and the appearance of Javik may not be contradictory, but instead an indicator that Javik belonged to one of the servant races in the Prothean Empire. Instead of despising the Protheans for enslaving his people, though, Javik is loyal to his people's conquerors, perhaps because he was born and raised during the war with the Reapers, and therefore sees the Protheans not as his oppressors, but instead his protectors working to stop the Reaper menace from destroying their lives. Alternatively, maybe his species wasn't really a slave race, but willingly subservient. The sad fact is that we really don't know much about Protheans, despite the fact that we get one as an NPC companion. For those of you that think the Collectors contradict this dumb fan theory, I'll speak briefly on them. It is a possibility that the Collectors, as well, are not really actual Protheans. Just like how Javik could identify as Prothean, yet not actually be a true Prothean, it's a possibility that what we believe are Protheans and Prothean Reaper abominations, Collectors, are actually one of the Prothean slave races. Perhaps the real Protheans were very powerful, but very few in number. What we know is the Protheans/Collectors could have just been one of the Prothean servant races. Perhaps the servant race that populated the majority of their military forces. Perhaps due to having a population large enough to assemble a capable army, or some similar factor. The real Protheans may have been like the Council, sitting in a shrine on the Citadel or the Prothean homeworld dictating the lives of trillions without actually doing anything themselves. Coordinating the war efforts in a lofty palace or secure fortress while the servant races, like Javik's species, were the ones fighting, dying, being harvested, and getting churned back out as Collectors. The real Protheans could have been like the Guardians from Green Lantern, all-powerful little elves that sit on weirdly tall thrones and delegate tasks to the lesser races, just as those blue dudes hand out assignments to the Lantern Corps. What we think were Protheans, Javik's species, could have been the shock troops of the Prothean Empire, the most populous and combat-able of the slave races that were assigned to compromise the bulk of the Prothean Empire's army. At Ilos, the Prothean distress message isn't Trinidadian, indicating the species we see as Prothean in Mass Effect 3 is just a slave race with its own unique accent after being forced to learn English. Their accent is the byproduct of their original culture that was overridden by Prothean conquering. The real Protheans were at the Citadel, ruling over it like the Guardians, which is why they sound so different in the message on Ilos than what we hear the Protheans sound like later on. All this is flimsy, of course, as I've already said. The inconvenient fact, as I mentioned before, is that even after 3 games, we really don't know much about Protheans or their society. And again, as I stated right off the bat, I don't really believe this fan theory. I did think it was a cool idea, though. It's definitely interesting to consider conceptually. The real truth is that BioWare probably just retconned what the Protheans looked like. Originally, they looked like a Lovecraftian horror, but as the series grew and the lore expanded and sequels were made, and writers possibly changed, and the collectors were introduced and fleshed out, they retroactively changed what the Protheans were supposed to look like to fit the new lore surrounding the collectors, being that they were a Prothean equivalent of husks. Maybe they thought squid-faced alien zombie monsters would be too cliché or ripped off D&D too much. They straight up look like mind flayers without faces. The Prothean Beacon's vision is itself retconned as well, in the 3rd game I believe. They show the vision again, but change the Protheans to look like the canon image we know now. I thought it was really interesting that they decided to change what the Protheans looked like. For now I'll just blame EA though.